attack. So who changed the CIA talking points and why? Does any of this make sense? Well, Stephen Yates is a former Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs to Vice President Dick Cheney. Stephen, thanks for being with us. Petraeus says he knew from day one that this attack was an al-Qaeda-affiliated terror attack, yet he says he later signed off on edited talking points which said that it wasn't. Doesn't that mean that Petraeus willingly supported a lie?
On the face of it, Greg, it certainly does. Really, there's only one possible explanation for why he may have got along that way, is that late in the game, an edited text could have come back for final clearance. He may have wrongly assumed there weren't consequential changes, and he learned after the fact that he had cleared on something he knew would be false.
Yeah, and now we're hearing, from Democrats and some in the administration saying, well, you know what, the terror attack was spelled out in the secret classified talking points. We just didn't put it in the unclassified version that was made public. Well, if that's accurate, then doesn't that mean that Americans were deliberately misled to hide the truth contained in the classified documents? And would there be any justification for that?
The only justification for withholding the truth that terrorism was involved, you wouldn't have to spell out who exactly was involved, what groups, what individuals. But the only excuse would be if saying so would put in jeopardy lives on the American homeland or lives among our deployed personnel. And just looking at the situation that played out, there's no argument for that.
Congressman Adam Schiff, who's a Democrat, had this to say. Take a listen.
The general was very clear. There was no politicization of the process. There was no White House trying to interfere with the process. None of that happened. None of it would have been tolerated.
How does a general or anybody know that if he doesn't know who edited the talking points?
Well, you're exactly right. It's impossible for him to have known. Just the way the process generally works, people in the White House would send out taskers to gather information, pull that information back in, but then another round of staffing would go on inside the White House, directed most primarily by the communications staff. The general would never have had visibility into how things changed in that process. And obviously, if he doesn't know who made the changes, he probably doesn't know that the changes happened until after the fact.
And it may have been for political reasons only. I mean, he doesn't know. Schiff doesn't know.
Correct.
Let me go to something else that is a real head scratcher. In the second debate, the president famously claimed that he did, in fact, call it a terror attack the very next day, September 12th, in the Rose Garden. Well, my goodness, if that's true, then why did he send out Susan Rice 4 days later to say, no, it was the video? That doesn't make sense, does it?
It doesn't make sense, and I think it's one of the things that we really need to dig into, because this was a false narrative. They knew it was a false narrative. And the 60 Minutes interview with President Obama after the Rose Garden remarks made very, very clear that Steve Croft had the impression that President Obama avoided calling Benghazi a terrorist attack, and President Obama made very clear that Benghazi and events in Cairo were very separate. And so right from the get-go, they had a relatively clear set of facts. It was okay to say those things to 60 Minutes. Therefore, it's indefensible to suggest it wouldn't have been okay to say as much and build on that theme with Susan Rice and Jay Carney, frankly, in the days ahead.
Yeah, and the president also said, look, Susan Rice didn't have anything to do with Benghazi. Well, nobody then in the news conference bothered to ask him, well, why did you send her out 4 days later on 5 different talk shows on Sunday to talk about Benghazi? That doesn't make sense. At his news conference, President Obama said this in reference to the attacks in Benghazi, and I'll quote him. My orders were, do whatever we need to do to make sure they're safe. That is to say, those who were under attack. Well, no help arrived. Turns out they weren't made safe. They were killed. Does that sound like the president's orders, therefore, commander-in-chief, were ignored or somehow refused, unless, of course, he never really made those orders?
Right. If the president meant what he said, there are really only two uncomfortable possibilities. One, he didn't really give those orders and what he said was untrue, or he gave them and they were violated by people in the chain of command. And if so, how are they not swiftly having disciplinary procedures in place to go after those who ignored the orders of the commander-in-chief? I just find it extremely implausible that those orders would have been given and ignored. I think that the people in the chain of command would be very motivated to save their own in a position of attack. And so it's more plausible in retrospect to expect that the order didn't really come from the White House in the way the president describes.
Today, the White House is claiming it did not make the controversial changes in those talking points. Do you buy that? And should people at the White House be forced to testify, maybe including the president?
Well, I don't buy it in substance and even just in process. I mean, the White House picks surrogates. The White House is in charge of the talking points and messages those people go forward. It was in the fever pitch of a presidential campaign. They would have been politically very sensitive to what they were talking about and the implications in politics. I think this was the fog of politics, not the fog of war. And I find it implausible the White House didn't change things.
Stephen Yates, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, coming up, they are already heroes, and now a team of